What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and just today we got the first, I guess, sort of official balance update for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. In their video interview last week, the Games Workshop design team had noted that they would be making some targeted changes to the game this week, and that's what we're getting today, specifically regarding Eldar's Strands of Fate mechanic, artillery or indirect fire weapons, as well as units with the towering keyword. And while they did do that sort of technically, the update itself is a bit of a mixed bag. So let's talk about exactly what changed and why it's maybe a little less surgical than they could have been. Now, in terms of actual mechanical changes to the game, only one rule was actually updated, and that was Eldar's Strands of Fate. For those who don't know, this is Eldari's ability to sub in dice rolls that they make at the start of the game called their Strands of Fate roll. At the beginning of the game, they generate a pool of fate dice. They essentially roll those fate dice and save the results for later. There are ways to manipulate these, change them around, or re-roll them, but that's the general premise. And over the course of the game, before they make a dice roll, they can sub in one of their fate dice on whatever facing it's rolled at the beginning of the game for whatever that roll would have been. Now, this mechanic has been around for a while. Adeptus Sororitas have used it with their miracle dice for ages, and it's a pretty interesting one for Eldari to have. The problem is that not only was the volume of fate dice that was generated each game much greater than anything we've seen out of Adeptus Sororitas in the recent past, but also it had a particularly strong effect when combined with weapons with critical hit or critical wound effects. Eldar being the faction with the most amount of devastating wounds in the game, which is an effect that triggers on a critical wound roll, so i.e. a wound roll of 6 generally speaking, and converts the damage of the attack into mortal wounds that automatically wound, ignore all saving throws, and can spill over damage and kill multiple models from a single attack. This meant that big weapons like D-Cannons or the Wraith Knight's heavy D-Cannon were able to sub in high fate dice numbers for automatic large numbers of attacks, automatic hits, automatic wounds, and converting those wounds directly into large numbers of mortal wounds as well, all through using high fate dice values. Now, while this would drain the pool of good dice results in the fate dice pool pretty quickly, there were ways, like I said before, to sub these in. A Farseer can turn 1 per turn into a 6, and the lower fate dice values are still useful on things like saving throws. So this made, at least for the first 1 to 2 turns of the game, Eldari armies both extremely good at delivering damage to their opponent, since generally speaking they could throw down 30 or 40 mortal wounds a turn from a ton of these large D weapons with devastating wounds, but also defend themselves pretty effectively too, because a lot of their primary frontline units like Wraithguard and Wraith Knights had high saving throws. They could sub in 4s and lower numbers to save against return fire. Now that has been changed by a single sentence, and this is pretty targeted and I think pretty effective. Now, fate dice can only be used once each phase. So if you use a fate dice in a phase, you can no longer use that for a different unit later on or a different roll. This means that while you can still interact with weapons with the devastating keyword or save yourself out of 1 big hit every turn, you no longer have the opportunity to dump all of your fate dice in a single turn and either survive the entire world of shooting at you or deliver absolutely crippling damage to your opponent's army. Honestly, I think this is pretty effective, and it's a solid change without having to go in and dig too deeply into the mechanic. It still makes a lot of existing lists and like archetypes useful, but less powerful than they were before, and the mechanic isn't quite as toxic. What it does mean, though, is that Eldar players will have a deeper pool of fate dice over the course of the game, so they're just going to fix their dice rolls to be a little bit more consistent as the game goes on, rather than using them to actually fuel their damage output. Now, on top of that, the other changes that were being targeted were at indirect fire weapons and units with the towering keyword. Both of these mechanics are relatively toxic right now because they have the ability to essentially ignore all intervening line of sight blockers. Indirect fire does so by just ignoring line of sight when choosing targets for its ranged attacks, by ignoring the line of sight blocking effect of ruined terrain. As I explained in my terrain video a couple weeks ago, while they still have to see the target with line of sight, ruined terrain will usually automatically block line of sight if it's intervening between the attacker and the defender. The towering keyword ignores that portion of it, so ruins that don't have a lot of true line of sight or solid wall blocking elements basically don't give you any protection against things like big knights and titans. Now, what were the changes to these mechanics to make them a little bit more palatable? There weren't any, in fact. All the design team elected to do was go down with a Control F find and replace and change all of the points values of almost every unit with these combinations of weapon abilities and keywords throughout the entirety of the game, regardless of what faction it is or how powerful those units were. So I'll run down a list of units with these keywords that were updated and their increased points. Adeptus Sororitas Exorcists were increased by 30 points. This is unfortunate for Adeptus Sororitas players because the Exorcist is really the only unit kind of holding that faction together. Otherwise, they are underperforming dramatically and don't have many game plans to fall back on. The Night Spinner went up 30 points for Eldari. The support weapon platforms went up 20. The Wraith Knight went up 105 points, and the Scathach Wraith Knight went up 55. For Astra Militarum, this is the faction almost entirely based around indirect fire. They're really kind of an indirect fire matters army, and they got enormous points increases, including 25 points to the Basilisk, 20 points for the Field Ordnance Battery, the Manticore, and the Wyvern, 30 points to the Colossus Mortar, 10 points to the Earthshaker Carriage, 15 to the Medusa Carriage, and a mind-boggling 50 for the Praetor. Grey Knights also got hit in the indirect fire crossfire a little bit here. Purgation Squads went up 5 points due to their ability to gain indirect fire when firing at a unit that is visible to another Grey Knight Psyker. That's not even really true indirect fire, so it's a little bit weird that they got hit. Units with the Towering keyword also got a similar change. Knights and Chaos Knights as well, getting massive points increases. And while this is fair, given that the Knight households are probably two of the top 3 or 5 best factions in 10th edition 40k right now, I don't know if all of the power of these factions was contained within their towering units. I actually think War Dogs and Armigers are much more undercosted than their bigger knights. But the bigger knights are what got hit, so I think all that changes is that these Knights and Chaos Knight armies take less of them and more of the small stuff. For Chaos Knights, the Abominant Desecrator and Despoiler, as well as the Acheron and Atropos, Castigator, Lancer, and Megara all went up 60 points. The Knight Tyrant increased 70, the Asterius increased 110, Porphyrion up 95, and the Knight Styrex up 60. For Imperial Knights, we basically have the exact same story, with more melee-focused Knights getting a little bit less of an increase. Canis Rex, the character, went up 90 points, whereas the Castellan increased 70, the Crusader 60, the Errant 55, the Paladin 60 as well, the Knight Preceptor up 55, the Valiant up 75, and the Warden up a measly 10. In terms of their Forge World Knights, the Asterius is up 110, the Porphyrion up a 100, the Acheron up 60, Atropos increased 55, Castigator increased 60. A little bit surprising there, as that one might be the best Forge World Knight that's in the list here. The Lancer up 65 points, the Megara up 60, and the Styrex up 65. Now, other super heavies with the Towering keyword were also hit across the game as well. The Khorne Lord of Skulls got a different points value increase depending on the faction you could take it in. The Chaos Space Marine Lord of Skulls went up 60, whereas the World Eater's Lord of Skulls was increased by a staggering 105 points. To be fair, the World Eater's Khorne Lord of Skulls gains all of their Blessing of Khorne abilities, but we have been seeing a little bit of success out of Chaos Space Marines in their Lord of Skulls list recently. Whether or not that stops because of this points increase, we'll just have to see. Tau saw increases to their Titanic units as well. The Storm Surge up 60 points, the Tau Tower Supremacy Armor up 105, as well as an increase to the Seraptech Construct up 70 points, and the Morkanaut up 45. That is the more ranged-oriented version of the Morkanaut-Gorkanaut duo team, and is a little bit flabbergasting, because I don't know if anybody was complaining about that one. We also saw a couple additional changes to specific indirect fire units, including Desolation Squads, which are up 10 points per model, up to a points value of 34. The Whirlwind up 25, as well as the Tyranid Biovore up 25. It also seems like the design team took the opportunity for this update to maybe fix some errors or oversights that they had in the previous version of the document. We saw things like Primaris Sword Brethren and Death Guard Plague Marines getting their unit size adjusted, I think to remain consistent with their boxed set contents, as well as the Tyranid Harpy also getting a staggering increase for a unit that probably wasn't taking that much, so it's a little bit surprising. Crucially, the Eldari Fire Prism was also increased by 25 points, and while it's not technically indirect fire, that was an undercosted unit to begin with. And that's just about it for the actual changes. No changes to the mechanics themselves beyond that Strands of Fate update. everything has been done with points. And like I said at the beginning of the video, points are kind of an indelicate way to change these mechanics. The towering and indirect fire mechanics have some significant problems, but just increasing the points value of everything with these mechanics across the entirety of the game is not exactly a great way to go about things. It's also important to note that not literally every unit that had these abilities or keywords on them were increased. Especially indirect fire units like Kairos Fateweaver and Thunderfire cannons remained unscathed, and exactly why this is, I don't know. Especially considering that a lot of specific units in underperforming factions were nerfed alongside the more powerful varieties of these unit archetypes. It is a little confusing. The real heart of the issue was the mechanics themselves, not necessarily the units that they were attached to, so if we had seen core rules changes to them, then that would have been a lot nicer. Big problem with the indirect fire rule specifically, though, is that a lot of the units that are on this list already had ways to ignore the indirect fire penalty, so there are very limited ways that you can go about changing that rule. You can't just make the penalty worse because it only affects the units that don't ignore it. Basically, half the units on the list are not going to be affected by a change to the actual core mechanics. But something like the towering keyword can be changed very easily. Maybe just delete it. It's actually kind of annoying in both directions. Knights can be seen through ruins and can now also see through ruins. If you just make them operate like normal units, basically all of those issues go away. You can both hide from them and they can hide from you and make the game more interesting and introduce a lot more counterplay. But that's not the direction we went in. I almost wonder if the design team's hands are tied a little bit and they cannot actually change the core mechanics of the game very much, just due to the fact that they'd be invalidating hard copies of these index cards, rules reference guides, or core rule books. So it may be that we're basically only looking at points changes in order to try to address these issues. Well, this update does go a little bit of the way to fixing some of the most toxic interactions, specifically those surrounding Eldari, and they do reduce the power level of the towering factions like Knights and Imperial Knights, which are the top end of the metagame right now. So it does help a little bit. I do think that sort of the indiscriminate nature and the fact that it probably wasn't thought through that much is a little bit unfortunate. And it's most likely going to be at least 3 months before we see another update to the Munitorum Field Manual. Until then, it's an unfortunate time to be someone playing one of those bottom factions. And with that, that is everything for the rules update this time around. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this update and if you think it was the correct way to go for Games Workshop. And big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.